Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Transfigured. I'm here with Ashley Lande today. We are going to be talking about her book and her story. Her book is called The Thing That Would Make Everything Okay Forever. Please check that out. I'll include links in the description to everything. Ashley, welcome to Transfigured.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
So I thought that we would begin by just having you tell a little bit about your story, but I guess maybe you could start with so why did you write a book, and how's that been going, and how's the experience of being a first-time author?
Yeah, it's felt extremely vulnerable. It's been a little scary. When I wrote it, I wrote it when I was pregnant with our now 2-year-old. And so there was a long process, like in postpartum. We were trying to do some of the editing process, and obviously that took a while because I had a newborn. And so I felt like there was a lot of time in between when I wrote it and kind of spilled my soul on the pages and the actual publication. So yeah, it's felt very, very real to have it out there in the world. And I've gotten a lot of wonderful feedback from friends, which has been great. But I have a neighbor with whom I'm friendly. I'm acquainted with her, and we have a friendly acquaintance. I wouldn't say we're intimate friends. And she told me she bought a copy, and for some reason that was a level of vulnerability like beyond friends and beyond strangers.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's been a little scary. It's been very good. It's been very heartening and encouraging to get feedback from people. And there were a lot of people that I had connected with before it was published through being on podcasts. I had really intentionally, before I was on Unbelievable, I had really intentionally sought out people from the hippie generation who had become Christians. I just wanted to hear their story. And so I've stayed connected with a lot of them, and it's been really encouraging to get their feedback. So yeah, it's been good. It's been exciting and scary and kind of naked feeling, but good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, good. It is always weird when like real life people suddenly figure out or find out about your online
Right.
presence. And I will say I've never been quite as vulnerable as you were in this book, and I still find that a creepy thing. Like when some neighbor or friend is like, "So wait, you have a podcast?" and they start listening to it. It's like, oh yeah.
It's like, oh, my worlds are colliding.
I like to keep those things separate.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I just want to be able to see you at, our children's basketball game and it not be weird. But
right.
Here we are. So, okay.
Yeah, too late for that.
Yeah.
That's funny. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your story, sort of as kind of a primer for the conversation and a teaser for the book? But I guarantee audience out there, no matter how much detail we go onto this podcast, there's still a lot more that I'd recommend checking out in the book, and that you tell your story very well.
Oh, thank you. So I was raised in a Methodist church. I wouldn't say that I'm grateful that there was some kind of foundation, but I wouldn't say faith was a hugely integrated part of our home life. And because since becoming a Christian as an adult, I meet people who were raised Christian, and I'm like, whoa, I wasn't raised Christian like that. I had no knowledge of Christian subculture. We didn't I don't remember reading the Bible together at home or praying together, except maybe before Thanksgiving.
Did you or did you not watch Veggie Tales?
No. Didn't even know Veggie Tales existed. Granted, by the time it reached its peak of popularity, I was probably a teenager anyway. But like I said, like no contact with Christian subculture at all. I was just very much mainstream, listen to the radio, knew all the words to This Is How We Do It by Montel Jordan. So was not raised intensively Christian, I guess I would say. And so it was pretty easy when I was 14, 15 to disavow Christianity because I never really had an understanding of it in the first place. Methodists don't do altar calls so I think I did go through the confirmation process when I was 13, but I don't know. I just never really I never understood anything. I never grasped anything. So it was pretty easy when I was 14, 15. There was a boy that I had a crush on who was an atheist, and I thought that was so edgy and cool. and I knew it would scandalize my parents to say that I was an atheist. And so it was really just kind of this purely rebellious thing. But it was also because, like I said, I didn't necessarily ever have faith of my own. I didn't really understand it. And so kept saying I was an atheist until I was maybe, I think 22, 21, 22. And toward the end of college, I had a good friend who said he had some psilocybin mushrooms. And I didn't really know much about psychedelics. I mean, I knew, superficial things. They're associated with hippies, but I didn't really know much about them at all. And I thought, why not? I was just kind of up for it. I thought, why not? And that night I had what I felt at the time was a really delightful experience. It was just really extremely fascinating, exotic, seductive. It was just interesting. Like I thought the sensory changes, the changes in perception, the visual hallucinations, I guess, or the visual distortions were really interesting. And the next morning I felt pretty good. I didn't have a hangover like I would have with alcohol. So I thought, wow, this is really great. And I wouldn't say at that time there was any kind of spiritual dimension to it. At least in my mind, there wasn't. I just felt like it was a really good time and it was really interesting. And so after that, over the next year, I think I sought out mushrooms a couple more times. Again, just had a good time, nothing really spiritual about those experiences. And then about a year from that first experience with psilocybin, I met a man who said he didn't have any mushrooms, but he had some LSD. And I thought, sure, why not? Same thing. And he kind of warned me that LSD was more powerful, which that's debatable. Some people have really shattering experiences on mushrooms too. But anyway, I just thought, oh, I've got this. I know what this is like. And I had a really psychologically, spiritually shattering experience on LSD that first time, to the point where I couldn't even decide if it was a good or a bad thing. It was really profoundly disorienting and confusing. I felt like my entire being had been obliterated. Although I felt like my being had been obliterated, I didn't have the experience yet at that point that some people talk about being immersed in an ocean of consciousness, which does dovetail pretty neatly with different New Age ideas. But so after that first time, I thought, wow, that was really something. I don't know what that something was. And I thought, I don't know if I ever want to do that again, but maybe. Oh, and I should mention at that time, I was also becoming really disillusioned with atheism. Mm-hmm. That was kind of like the new atheists had kind of crested at that point, but they were still pretty popular. And I was really into Christopher Hitchens. I just thought he was great. And his most recent book had come out, God Is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. And I was super excited to read it because I guess I felt like it was going to kind of cement my atheism, my arguments against God. And I remember I was so eager to read it. And then I remember getting maybe halfway through it and just feeling increasingly like hollow and disenchanted with his ideas and the things that he was offering in place of religious transcendence were so unsatisfying. Like he was like, oh, we have art and music, and literature, but then he would reference Dostoevsky. And at that point, I don't think I had even read any Dostoevsky, but I kind of knew that, there was something Christian about Dostoevsky. So I thought that was kind of odd. And so I was just so those things kind of were converging at the same time.
So that's interesting. You were sort of deconstructing out of atheism, sort of as you were going deeper on this psychedelic journey.
Yeah.
And you see like Sam Harris and, there are a fair number of sort of high profile atheists who talk about psychedelics positively. Yeah. But it seems like the kind of in general, the psychedelic community is not very atheistic or.
That's true. Yeah.
That there's a little bit of a clash and a tension there between those two different worldviews.
For sure, yeah, and the psychedelic community, by the same token, is certainly not Christian, but I would say you'd be hard pressed to find a whole lot of like hardline materialist people in the psychedelic world. almost everyone assumes that there's something beyond, most people are pretty nebulous about their definitions, but they would assume that there is something beyond the material. So yeah.
So then where's your story keep going from there?
Yeah, so like I said, I wasn't sure after that. Sorry, my toddler is in here. I don't know. Hopefully my daughter will come get him.
No problem.
So like I said, I wasn't even sure after that, immediately afterward, that I ever wanted to do that again. But within a week or two, I thought, well, I have to do that again. I just have to see what else there is in that experience. And so maybe about 2 weeks later, I was able to find someone, through networking with friends who had LSD. And I took it again. And that time I did have what I felt at the time was a pretty profoundly spiritual experience. I felt like I came in contact with something beyond myself. I transcended myself somehow. And because I did have some of the language of Christianity, I was comfortable calling that God. And a lot of people in the psychedelic New Age world will say like the universe, which always felt a little hokey to me, although I did say it sometimes. I think I said it in the book a few times. But I felt comfortable saying God. And I remember after that second time, tearfully calling my dad, with whom I had argued about the existence of God, and telling him I believed in God now. And I think he was, and of course I didn't tell him it was, from a drug-induced experience. And I think he was kind of cautiously hopeful at that. But of course I would not have defined God in the same terms that he would have at that point. I don't even know how I would have defined God at that point, just something larger than myself. And so, that kind of began my love affair with LSD. I believed LSD was essentially my religion, and it was just happened to be. I was most attracted to LSD because it was the psychedelic on which I'd had the most powerful experiences. But I mean, I would also, if there were mushrooms available, I would take those. If there, at one point we had salvia, I would smoke that. So, but yeah, I would say from that point on, it was, gosh, of course a lot happened, but the course of like the next 7 years, pretty regularly, at least in those early years, pretty regularly taking LSD.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And one thing I notice in your story is that, and this is seemingly common in sort of a lot of, stories around drugs and addiction, is that you have to like keep working harder and harder and harder to get what it was that it felt like you had found the first time. And that seems increasingly out of grasp.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it felt like the goal, I could never have defined necessarily what the goal was. I guess I would have listened to language about and read things about enlightenment. I guess as much as I could define what the goal was, I would have defined it in those terms, kind of the Eastern mysticism, like there's this state of consciousness that we can attain that is beyond suffering, beyond individuated existence, beyond ego, beyond everything. But it did seem like the more I pursued that goal, the farther it receded into the distance. Yeah, there was also this desperation to get there, even though it got to the point where I remember particularly when I was taking LSD a lot by myself and got to a really scary place where I was really disconnected from reality. I kind of constructed my own reality. And it just felt like the goal, whatever it was, like I said, it was kind of murky from the beginning. It got increasingly muddied and increasingly unclear to the point where things didn't seem to matter anymore. Like life and death, there was no distinction between them. And it was a really scary place to be. But that's absolutely true. And it's interesting because people love to say, psychedelic enthusiasts and proponents love to say that psychedelics are non-addictive. And I think that's true in the sense that they're not giving you like, a dopamine hit when you take them.
They're not pharmacologically addictive the way, say, an opioid is.
Exactly. But I think they are highly addictive in another sense. Yeah.
Yeah. And another thing that I notice in your story is that as you were kind of having to work or try harder on this sort of spiritual journey to get to whatever it was, enlightenment, nirvana, or what have you, is that you paid like sort of more and more attention to like your own sort of bodily purity in terms
Mm,
of like
yeah.
dieting and other sorts of stuff, and like this almost like kind of like sacrificial preparation of the
Yeah.
setting before you did it. And it was like these kind of old archetypal patterns of religion that
Hmm.
you need to, be pure, and that
Yeah.
you need to offer the right sacrifices to get the right thing, were like coming stronger and stronger to the fore, and maybe sort of like icons and images of Hindu gods and stuff
Yeah.
like that. Like it was getting more and more sort of obviously religious, and sort of almost like a pagan kind of sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And like you said, at one point I got into raw veganism. There was just this compulsion to, yeah, to absolutely purify my body. Like if I could just eat the right things, if I could think the right things. And there's an prominent idea in Buddhism about the need to control your thinking. And that also kind of, I guess you call it a pop new age idea of, kind of the cheesiest example of which would be like The Secret, that was popular, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago. This idea of manifestation, like people talk about manifestation, like you don't want to think about negative things, you might manifest them. You only want to focus on positive things. You want to control your thoughts. And I remember years after I had quit using psychedelics, so this is probably just several years ago, there was a woman that I really revered in the New Age community as kind of she just seemed to embody everything that I thought was my goal at the time. She was super natural, super hippie, and yeah, just seemed to embody everything that I thought was good. And I remember listening to her on a podcast a few years ago. I just thought, I wonder what she's up to these days. And so I looked at her Instagram and I started listening to this podcast, and she was discussing how she years ago, a couple decades ago, she had a friend who was murdered by a stranger. The man just broke into her friend's home, stabbed her to death. So just this horrible thing. But she was talking about how she had reached out to that man. He's serving life in prison, and she had reached out to him. And it was kind of this admirable, like she was trying to do this kind of a forgiveness thing, but it was within the new age, ideology. So it wasn't quite, I don't know. It just didn't seem quite right to me. But she said at one point, she was talking about how her friend was one of her friend's greatest fears, if not her greatest fear, was precisely what happened to her, being murdered. And so she said, it makes me wonder, did she attract that to herself? And I had to turn it off at that point. I just was like, this is like the logical outworking of these beliefs, though. Like, I don't blame her for, like, this is the logical outworking of that belief, that we manifest our own reality. But I just thought, gosh, like that, the idea that we would manifest our own reality, and to an extent, it's a biblical idea that you reap what you sow to an extent. But the idea that we completely manifest our own reality is really terrifying and burdensome.
Right. It
Yeah.
it sounds exciting at first that you can
Yeah.
make good things happen to yourself.
Right.
But then the bitter pill on the other side of that is,
Yeah.
if everything in your life is controlled by you and your own mind, then the bad things that happen to you were also controlled by you and your own mind.
Exactly. Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
Yeah. And so what seems like freedom eventually looks like the opposite. I
Yeah.
think that was also sort of a repeated story, or a repeated theme in your story, that what seems like freedom or self-empowerment in the beginning, as opposed to, like serving a god, seems like the opposite of freedom. If you're, becoming a slave for Christ, it seems like the opposite of freedom. Whereas if
Right.
you can do these things for yourself, and if you're your own master and your own guide, what have you, and you're the master of your own manifesting destiny towards
Right.
enlightenment, it seems like way more free than the other thing. But then it leads into these weird sorts of traps where all of
Yeah.
a sudden you're praying harder and harder to this, goddess that doesn't seem to do anything anymore.
Yeah, exactly. It becomes a terrible burden, what seemed freedom at first. And I remember that at first with psychedelics, there did seem to be this expansive sense of freedom and liberation and knowledge. But then in the end, it did become, gosh, horribly, horribly burdensome. And also that's why when I became a Christian too, which, you know, getting ahead of myself in the story, but when I became a Christian, it was such a profound relief to realize that, I probably said this in the book, I've said it a few times, but that not only could I not save myself, which is essentially what I've been trying to do, it was impossible. Like I didn't have to. It was such a relief. So yeah, that's precisely right. What feels like freedom in the beginning, like slowly morphs into enslavement, and that was absolutely my experience.
Yeah, whereas voluntarily accepting a form of enslavement to Christ is actually what feels like freedom. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
So tell me about the part of your story where you start to kind of run into sort of the end of this psychedelic journey, and Jesus starts reaching out to you. What happens next after that?
Yeah, there were several things kind of converging at the same time. My husband was becoming pretty disillusioned, and it's interesting, he will even say now that he never had a bad trip, whereas I had plenty of bad trips. He never really had a bad trip, but he just realized it just became increasingly vacuous feeling, like it just became increasingly empty for him. And he started wondering, and he was really into reading Alan Watts and like all kinds of and like Zen literature, just all things from different traditions. And he was more like a student of religions than I was, but he was just becoming really disenchanted with things. And he finally thought, like, well, why not take a look at Christianity, which is the one thing he and I had always both kind of avoided. He was raised Mormon. Well, they don't call themselves Mormon. My in-laws, they're a specific sect of Mormonism called the Restoration, but they embrace the Book of Mormon as
You're in Kansas City, right?
Well, we're from Kansas City. We live
Okay.
in rural Kansas now, but yeah, we're
Gotcha.
from Kansas, the Missouri side. So
Right. Yeah. I have some relatives in my family tree that were in some of those offshoots in Mormonism that
Okay.
got centered
Yeah.
around Kansas City. I don't think it was that particular one, but anyway. Yeah.
Yeah.
Go
Yeah.
ahead.
So yeah, in Independence, Missouri is kind of the hub of, and that's where they live. So he was raised with that and rejected it as a teenager the same way I did. But yeah, I think he was just becoming increasingly disenchanted with all these different New Age systems and Eastern mysticism as a way to really explain reality. And I think the same way I did, like as a way to offer redemption. There's no real redemption offered in these things. And so he started reading just with the intention of exploring, another kind of religion in the whole grab bag. I think at that point we would have been really into the idea of perennial theory or perennial philosophy. There are all these different roads. They're kind of different lenses that different cultures have seen the truth through, and they're all kinds of the same, or there's similarities, and they all kind of lead to the same. There's like an overarching philosophy that binds all of them together.
Different rhymes on the same theme,
right,
different accents or something.
Right, right. But he started reading like Athanasius and Origen, and he started thinking that maybe, and he actually, I'm sure you've probably heard of Ram Dass, who was, and Ram Dass actually said in one of his books, he talked about how you should embrace whatever religious tradition that is primary in the culture in which you find yourself. So my husband liked that idea. He said, well, here we are, in the Midwest, American Midwest, we should try Christianity. And I was really stubbornly resistant to it. And he started going to church. I wouldn't go with him. And he got to the point where he said, I don't know if this is true or not, but I really feel called to pursue it. And at that same time, like I said, I was also becoming really disillusioned with, I think for me, a huge turning point, probably for my husband as well, I'm sure he'd say this, was having children. After we had our first child, just these ideas that I'd embraced, like escaping individual existence is the ideal. Individual existence is an illusion. It's not a good illusion. The ego is an illusion. The goal is to transcend all of this through a state of consciousness, I would embrace the idea that once we die, we are just kind of melded back into this ocean of consciousness, into the all, and that's beautiful and wonderful. But once I had my own child, and I just was so overcome with love for him, and him in his hymness, in his unrepeatable hymness, I didn't like that idea anymore. And I remember there was this book that one of our friends at the time had given us, and this friend was really into psychedelics and the same things we were. And he gave us this book, and it was a children's book, but it was like these ideas that we are all kind of made of the same thing, and we're kind of interchangeable with one another. It was taking these ideas and bringing them down to this really simplistic level, like in the language of a children's book. And the narrator was this little boy, and he was saying, like, I am the sun, I am my feet, I am the puppy across the street. And I just remember thinking, like, I can't read this to my kid. Like, this is stupid. I just felt like this is dumb. And I just thought, so that really got me thinking, like, do I actually believe this? And I also looked at my child. I'm like, I don't want him to transcend his individual existence. Like, I don't want him.
He's not the dog across the street in my mind or in my heart. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, I just remember that being kind of a turning point that really, I wasn't ready to embrace Jesus Christ at that point, but I just thought, this is dumb. Like, when you take it from up here, and somebody like Alan Watts could make it sound so intellectual and so sophisticated, and when you bring it down here, like, it sounds so stupid. And
like as if the idea doesn't scale very well. Right?
Right,
That's something that Paul Vanderklay talks about. Like, one of the merits of Christianity is you can read Bible stories to your kids as their bedtime stories at age 2 or 3, and it doesn't sound dumb. And you can be Origen and be a super sophisticated philosopher theologian, or you can be a child or anywhere in between, and it can have a profundity and a truth wherever you're at. But these sorts of kind of new age, very kind of philosophical, metaphysical ideas, when you try and turn it into a child's book, it doesn't sound right anymore.
Exactly. Yes, I love that idea. That's perfect. Yeah. And with Christianity, there, like you said, there's profundity at every level. And with this, it was just so exposed at the level of a child. It was so exposed. And around that time too, I had a childhood friend that I'd reconnected with somehow. I'm guessing, I can't remember exactly, but I'm guessing she reached out to me, because I remember when we were in college, she was raised, she never abandoned the Christian faith in which she was raised. And I get the impression she was raised more Christian than I was. Her family always seemed, more engaged in their faith, and it was more a part of their family life. And I remember in college, she had really, like, claimed the Christian faith as her own. She had really experienced this kind of revival, and she met her husband through a Bible study. And I remember she sent this email out to a group of us who had been friends, and she said, just the language that she used, I felt like it was so earnest to me at that time, that I think my heart was just so cynical that it felt really hokey. And it was just, I was cringing, because she would say things like, God really has really been moving in my life. God really started shaking up my world. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is ridiculous. And this was probably before the mushroom experience. So I was definitely like hardline atheist at that point. But years later, once we both had children, like I said, I'm sure she probably reached out to me, and we started getting our children together for play dates. And I remember I would just kind of go off about whatever new age theory I was into at the time. I had like no self-awareness about just spouting off about anything. Like I said, and even though I was becoming disenchanted with all these things, I still had one foot firmly in that world. And like I said, she was very much a devoted Christian, and she would just listen to me. She was extremely patient, and she would just listen to me. And she would never argue with me. You know, she would never say, "Well, that's wrong. I think you're dumb." She's a very, very sweet person. And she would just, a lot of times she would just respond with a verse from the Bible or a passage from the Bible. She said, "Well, the Bible says this." And I'm thinking, well, I guess the Bible is interesting. It's one holy book among many, even though I hadn't actually read it at that point. I had such delusional arrogance. It was embarrassing. But
Well,
and
on the subject of that delusional arrogance, I think that's actually sort of an important point, that in the psychedelic community, there seemingly is this, like, we've got something that those other people don't,
yes,
and if
for
they
sure.
haven't been where we have been, then they're just sort of clueless dupes or something like that.
Absolutely.
And maybe from a
Yeah.
certain perspective, there's almost a hint of truth to that, that they're experiencing something that these other people just don't even know about. But it
Yeah.
does cause this sort of I don't know, self-righteous arrogance and condescension.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. Absolutely. Absolutely it does. And you can see that in people, like, you know, when you read things that Timothy Leary was probably a little worse than Ram Dass this way, but when you read things that Timothy Leary wrote, and even things, I think things that Terence McKenna wrote, I know a lot of people love him in the psychedelic world, but I was never big on him, because even then there was this, for as much as they gave lip service to ego death, and, you know, I've had my ego obliterated. I remember even reading something, I got turned off of Terence McKenna because he was talking about, you know, how can I go out, I'm paraphrasing, but how can I go out and be among these people, you know, like the plebes who don't have this experience, you know, when I've like been in the palaces of a Turkish prince. He said something like that, you know, like how can I even be among these people? And so there is this weird, yeah, there's this, for all the talk about ego death, there's a lot of ego inflation, like a lot. And I
An ego
absolutely,
that
yeah.
gets inflated by how much your ego has died, sort of,
Right. Yeah. It's
right.
ironic, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I absolutely had that feeling like, well, it's nice that she has her little beliefs, you know, but she hasn't had the experiences that I've had, even though so many of those experiences like some of those experiences were downright traumatic. Like for a while, even after I quit psychedelics, there were certain experiences that I didn't, just made my palms sweat to even really think about. So really traumatic experiences, and yet I still had this delusional arrogance. But that friend Carrie, who was a Christian, she around that time she had a son that was a little bit older than my son, and then she had a 2-year-old daughter named Joella, and Joella started getting ill. At first, it seemed just like a normal childhood illness. She ran a fever for a few days, but then the fever kept going. It didn't go away, and she had some bleeding on her gums. And so finally they took her to a doctor, but finally they were able to get a diagnosis, and it was leukemia. And she, I think from the point of diagnosis to her passing away, it was just like 3 weeks. So just incredibly heartbreaking, devastating. And that really shook me up. I mean, it was terrible. That really shook me up. And also thinking of that in terms of the New Age belief systems that I had embraced. And I could not stand the idea of her not existing anymore. There was no, like I said, there was no redemption in those ideas. Absolutely no redemption. Like it just felt like, okay, if I want to continue believing those things, then for Joella, this is just the end of the story. You know, dying in pain. And I'm sure, obviously, I'm sure they made her as comfortable as possible, but there was suffering involved still. Like this is the end of the story. Like now she'll just be absorbed into this ocean of consciousness, absorbed back into the all. And there was absolutely no solace, no comfort in that thought. And so that really had a profound effect on me. And also witnessing the way that Carrie and her husband grieved, and that I think it's in Thessalonians, like they grieved, they did not grieve as those who had no hope.
Mhm.
And I couldn't help but contrast thinking of, what if this happened to my child? Like I don't even know what I would do. I would have no grounds for hope for the future if this happened to my child. I would have no category sufficient in my belief system to handle this.
Or maybe even some
Yeah.
fear that had been your fault, right? Through that sort of
Right. Yeah.
manifestation, dark logic. Yeah.
Exactly.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Yeah. So that all those threads were kind of converging at the same time, and I was really breaking. Yeah.
Yeah. So then what happened?
Yeah. Yeah.
I,
So
I
yeah.
remember you mentioned you were at the funeral. And was there a song during the funeral service that really caught your attention?
I don't remember if they played it at the funeral service, but um, Carrie we kind of stayed in touch afterward for, I don't know, 6 months to a year. It's hard to remember the exact timeline because it's been so long ago, but she had told me in one of the emails she sent me that the hymn "It Is Well" with my soul had really ministered to her and her husband, and they had actually performed it at their church maybe 3 to 6 months after Joella passed away. And despite, like I said, growing up in the church somewhat, I didn't remember ever having heard it, or if I heard it, I didn't pay attention. And so she had encouraged me to listen to it. And I put it on a playlist on Spotify, and I forgot about it. And then there was a spring day where, like I said, I absolutely reached the end of myself. I had reached the end of my hopefulness in psychedelics. Oh, and also another thing that happened was, like I said, I can't remember the exact timing with this. I think it was after Joella passed away. I decided that maybe the problem, and this is kind of a sub strain of thinking in the psychedelic world, some people are only into natural psychedelics. And so I thought maybe the reason that I cannot have a good experience on LSD anymore is because maybe LSD is bad, which is just this desperate rationalizing, trying to figure out. And because like I said, I loved LSD. That was my favorite psychedelic. But I thought maybe that's the problem. Like maybe LSD is impure because it's created in a laboratory, and I need to go back to mushrooms. And so I actually grew my own
Right.
mushrooms.
Just sacrifice
Yeah.
harder and it'll
Exactly.
yeah.
Exactly. Yes,
Mhm.
exactly. And so I grew my own mushrooms, and I remember I would pray over them. And when I say pray, I mean, I would, I don't even know what I would say. I would use some of my yoga chants that I knew, like the Sanskrit that I didn't even necessarily understand. And I just thought, there again, I thought if I can purify them enough, if I can infuse them with love and light, and I'll be guaranteed to have a good experience again, to reclaim that initial high, that initial euphoria, that initial sense of freedom. And so yeah, we had a night. My kids, at that point, we had my daughter too, and we had a night to ourselves. And I thought, okay, this is it. And we blended them up and we drank them and sat there for a while. And I got the feeling, oh, maybe they weren't good, maybe they didn't happen. And then it hit me like a ton of bricks. The room started changing, the walls started breathing, like the colors started running down in a waterfall. And immediately I just had this horrible horrible sinking feeling in my gut, like, not this again. It
Mm.
was this sense of dread, like, not this place again. I'm so sick of this. Like, there's nothing good about this place. There's nothing fruitful about this place anymore, if there ever was. And I remember I had a bad trip, a pretty bad trip. I just felt like everything was collapsing. Any meaning, that was left in, there wasn't any meaning left in the world. Everything was collapsing. Matter was collapsing. Meaning was collapsing. Nothing meant anything anymore. Nothing mattered. And at one point, I remember, my husband tried to encourage me. He was fine. And at one point, I kind of rallied myself, and I thought, I'm going to find God. And I started, the rental house we were in at the time, it had 2 bedrooms and then a Jack and Jill bathroom. And I remember I started pacing through this circuit around the living room, the bedroom, bathroom. And I felt like God was eluding me. And it was this really sorrowful feeling. I mean, it was absurd that I thought I could just, if I could go fast enough, I could catch God. But then it also felt like I was this, just like this train on a track and I couldn't escape it. It was, yeah, it was bad. It was a bad experience. So after that, I actually had some mushrooms left that were growing in the basement that I was going to save for the future. And I think they got overtaken with mold. Like I opened the styrofoam cooler and they're just covered with mold. And I was like, I don't even care anymore. And at that point I was definitively done. I was done with psychedelics. I was done. And so anyway, fast forward to that day on the porch where I put on that playlist with It As Well on it. And my children were playing on the porch. It was this beautiful spring day. And my children were playing on the front porch. And I wasn't even necessarily listening to the music that was playing, but all of a sudden, and I can only describe it as like God, snapped me to attention when that song came on. And I actually listened to the lyrics and what it was saying. And I remember at that point, I had conceded to going to church with my husband, but I felt like I couldn't penetrate the mystery. Like I couldn't understand. And I, part of the problem I'm sure was I was going at it from these new age angles. I was still kind of going at it from,
you'll make sense of this inside your perennialist
right. Exactly.
box, right?
Yeah. That's what I thought. Like, this is something that I'm going to kind of shoehorn into this other system that I already have going, even though that system wasn't working. But I couldn't seem to understand it. And I remember sitting there on the porch that day and looking at my children and thinking about Joella and thinking about how precious my children were to me and what an undeserved gift they were. And hearing the lyrics of that music and hearing about my sin nailed to the cross and I bear it no more. And just, I started weeping and I felt like I finally understood, not necessarily by this intellectual mechanism but I finally understood. And another thing is in the New Age world, there's no concept of sin. Insofar as there would be some kind of a concept of sin, there's just like, we've forgotten that we're perfect. We've forgotten that, we just
ignorance is the sin of your true inner divinity.
Exactly. Exactly. So, but I had felt over the preceding months and years, I'd felt this heaviness with that because on some level I knew that wasn't true. Like that wasn't all that was wrong with me in the world. Like there was something more foundational here. Like there was something from the very bottom that was cracked, and so I knew that, and I had a growing sense of that. And so it was such a relief to be able to say like, oh, like, yes, like the world is fallen, like I am broken. Like this is true. I can acknowledge this. I don't have to pretend anymore. And it was just a really beautiful moment, and such, like I said, such a profound relief and true freedom from all of these things that I had been pursuing that had become increasingly imprisoning, like we had talked about earlier.
Right. So what felt different about that moment, listening to It As Well with my soul on your porch? I mean, you've had a lot of pretty spiritual high experiences and read a lot of spiritual and theological literature. I mean, you could call it theological variety.
Sure. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And this kind of pharmacologically supercharged spiritual experiences, and then here you are just sort of kind of having an ordinary moment on your porch. What exactly was different about that sunk deeper?
Yeah, I think it was the intimacy of it was really piercing. Like that was something that was always, I guess, like a problem for me. The idea of the incarnation, I just could not understand that. There was something about it that seemed too like narrow. I don't know what the word to use. Like, because I had been so immersed in all these expansive ideas about like if there was any mention of Christ in the New Age world, it was Christ consciousness. Like this, you're attaining this level of consciousness that's the same as Christ, or there was so much like expansiveness, like it almost like too big for there to be any degree of intimacy about it, or any degree of I don't know. I feel like I'm not describing this very well, but
particularity, right? Like
yeah,
to
yeah,
focus on
yeah,
details or particularity is to miss the point, and to
right.
be too, I don't know, obsessed with the mundane or something like
Yeah,
that, as
exactly,
opposed to
exactly.
like
Yeah,
actually enchanting the mundane,
yes,
or yeah, giving
yeah,
meaning and purpose to the mundane.
yeah, exactly, exactly.
Hmm.
Thank you. That's very good. And so there was, yeah, there was like a level of intimacy to it that I think I had been yearning for and craving, and also that the idea of being able to acknowledge like this very much mattered. Like the death of Joella very much mattered. Her life very much mattered, and she's not just going to be dissolved into the ether. You know,
Hmm.
like her life mattered eternally, and her individuated existence is matters eternally. So I think that was the difference. Like everything about those psychedelic experiences had been kind of disintegration, and like
Right.
this,
Almost like a practice or trained apathy.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
and then the
yeah,
opposite of apathy is pathos, right? The passion of
yeah,
Jesus is the opposite of apathy.
yes, yes,
Hmm.
yeah, exactly, exactly. And so I think it was that the piercing intimacy of it that was so different. And I've thought too, there's always been my experiences, like my intense, completely sober experiences of the presence of God and the presence of the Holy Spirit have been there's like a cleanliness to them, which I guess holiness would probably be the right word to use, but that's just the word that comes to mind, is like cleanliness to them that was never present in my psychedelic experiences. Like I remember, particularly after I had a bad trip, which I mean, my very first trip on LSD was kind of a bad trip. You have that, once you've fallen off the horse, like you have that awareness of how bad a bad trip can get. And so sometimes even on the mountaintop, thereafter, when I would have good trips, there was always a precariousness to it. There was always because the God that I worshipped was not reliable. Like the
Hmm.
God that I worshipped was in a way ever changing and
Yeah.
fickle. So I never quite knew what to expect. I never quite knew. And there's lots of people in the psychedelic world, they'll like to say there's no such thing as a bad trip, which I think is incredibly gaslighting. There's absolutely such a thing as a bad trip. And some people truly don't psychologically recover from bad trips. Like acid casualties are not just a myth. But yeah, there was always this precariousness to it, and that is obviously not true with experiences of the living God.
Hmm.
So yeah.
Can you talk about what role music played, sort of both in your psychedelic life and then afterwards, and sort of what your relationship to music is? Because it sounds like music is an important part of your journey and story as well.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So I remember when we were, uh, I should say, I met my husband at our acid dealer's house. So it was a match made in heaven, you know.
Match made in heaven, yeah.
Yeah. But we celebrated 16 years of marriage by the grace of God this past summer.
Congratulations.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you. And so we were super into, like, he introduced me to John McLaughlin and Ravi Shankar and all these kind of like darting guitar that felt really psychedelic, that felt really, so we were into whatever. And of course, like the Beatles, George Harrison. I loved Bob Dylan. I still love Bob Dylan, but just and we were more like into, I guess, more identified with old school 60s hippie culture. I think I find it so interesting that that culture kind of morphed into rave culture. And even now at psychedelic festivals, there's like a ton of EDM. You can't get away. I remember we went the psychedelic festival we went to that we kind of fell in love at. Like you could not escape the EDM. It was so, and of course we were on drugs, but it's just really fascinating to me that there's like this, that's a whole nother topic, but there's this dark strain in the art and music of psychedelic culture that's really intriguing to think about. But yeah, so we were super into anything that could be, yeah, that could be labeled psychedelic, that felt psychedelic, that sounded psychedelic, that would kind of inspire visual hallucinations when on psychedelics. And it's interesting. Once I quit and we became Christian, there's still some of that music that I find it hard to even listen to, just because it reminds me. So I feel like God has brought me a really long way in heal. And for the first few years after I quit, I would still have flashbacks. A lot of times I would wake up in the middle of the night and I would be full on tripping, and I would just sit there and pray. A lot of times if I just called in the name of Jesus Christ, it would go away, which really amazed me.
Wow.
And, but yes, gradually that's faded away. That hasn't happened in a long time, thank God. But yeah, some of that music I find difficult to even listen to, just because it reminds me of that. But
that
yeah.
detail.
Yeah.
Because I grew up in a church that was basically downstream from the Jesus movement, right?
Yeah.
Like I sort of mentioned this to you before the cameras were on. Like my dad has, I'll just say, a vaguely similar story to yours. And then I got really involved with sort of a branch of the Jesus movement, I think in like 1971 or something like that. And that a lot of the people in my church growing up were baby boomers about my dad's age, who had had similar journeys in and out of this sort of stuff. And so when I was a teenager, I loved playing electric guitar. I loved Led Zeppelin and Jimi Hendrix and Eric Clapton and all that, because it's the most fun guitar music to play. And like various people in my dad's of my dad's generation in my church would not like that music and would tell me, would have some various thing of like, well, we don't listen to that anymore and stuff like that. I always just thought that was sort of like stodgy.
Right.
It's like, come on, get over it. It's like, what, are you do you have some Christian alternative to Eric Clapton that I'm supposed to play on the guitar? Like, no, you don't. It's like, it's harmless. Like, but when I heard that detail of your story, I'm like, oh, I suddenly had a lot more sympathy for them. That it had these negative tainted connotations for them that they were coming out of, that I mean, it didn't have that for me, but it gave me a sympathy and a perspective on that point that I had never had before. So thanks.
They're not just prudes. It's like, we have that baggage with it. And it's funny, I do still like listening to, my husband was a huge Yes fan when we met, and it took me a while to come around to them, but there's an album, Close to the Edge, that to us at the time felt really psychedelic. And I can still listen to that, but because I think it is a really beautiful album. But I remember at the time, my husband swears up and down, he never told me this, but for some reason I got the idea in my head that they did that they did that entire album in one take when they were all high on acid, just like sitting in a circle having a powwow. I don't know how I got that idea in my head, but I did. My husband swears he never told me that. But then I remember, gosh, it's probably been 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, looking it up for some reason on Wikipedia, and no, it was like this arduous, like months and months long process. And a lot of the band members were like super duper perfectionists, to the point that trying to remember the drummer's name. My husband would kill me. He loves Yes so much. I'm
not a big Yes fan.
So
I can't help you on that one.
The drummer, he said, it quoted in this Wikipedia article, he said, like, it was the worst experience of my life to do this. And it just cracked me up, because I had this idea like, oh, they're all just jamming like high, they're like on the same wavelength, high on acid, and that never happened. It was this arduous, painstaking process that this guy said was one of the worst experiences of his entire life. So I just thought that was interesting. Funny. But sometimes when you have that baggage, and like I said, I feel like God has it's blessed me so much in healing me from all of that, but there's still just some of those things I'm like, it just, the baggage is there.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. So a question that I've had lurking in my mind that I've been curious to ask you is that, do you think that this new age sort of worldview, theology, religious attitude is just sort of this thing that's kind of riding along this kind of psychedelic experience, and that it's really, it could almost be anything that rides along the psychedelic experience. It's just that for circumstances that might be a little bit hard to explain, that in our present situation, that this kind of, whatever you want to call new ageism, is the thing that kind of takes advantage of the psychedelic experience and tries to co-opt it towards itself? Or is there actually something about the psychedelic experience that lends itself to these ideas of ego death and melting into the all, and et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, it's definitely the latter. It's definitely the latter. I've wondered many times, and I think we have to consider the spiritual forces at work, behind the experience. You're opening all these doors that I don't really think were meant to open, and I don't think that particularly a bad trip and probably a good trip too are things that the human, like God did not design our human psyches in their current state to bear or to contain. And so I think it's absolutely like a natural outgrowth of the psychedelic experience. And like I said, I've wondered many times why that is. And I think a few years ago, I need to reread it, but a few years ago I read Miracles by C.S. Lewis for the first time. And I found it fascinating. He discussed a lot about how pantheism is what is like the original heresy. It's what the human mind reverts to in the absence of God's revelation. And I thought, wow, that's really fascinating to think about these ideas of, and like I said, my first experience on LSD felt very obliterative. It felt like my entire being had been subverted, turned upside down. I didn't know which way was up. I didn't know what was true. I didn't know who I was. I didn't know what reality was. And so to think of that, there's this kind of clearing of the slate that occurs. And I think of that too in terms of, I always forget, it's in a couple of the Gospels, the story that Jesus tells about a man, like a demon goes out of a man, and then he wanders and then returns to find the house clean and swept. And he brings back 7 of his friends with him, and the man's condition is worse than before. And I've thought about that a lot in terms of acid, because there is this clean and swept aspect to it, to the psychedelic experience, where it's kind of obliterating everything that has come previously. And so I think it's absolutely, like I said, it's absolutely the latter. It is a natural out, like when I found that kind of, and I really hadn't been familiar with New Age belief systems before that first time I tried acid. But then once I discovered that belief system, I was like, oh, this is it. Like, this is the truth, because it dovetailed so nicely with
it explained what you had experienced.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
That's interesting. And so what in the world is going on with all of this stuff? So like we sort of talked about how psychedelics tend to obliterate atheism as a viable worldview. Yeah. Maybe not for everyone, but for a lot of people, it seems like it is giving a sense that there's something transcendent.
Yeah.
Perhaps that the mind is bigger than just a physical process in your brain, except that your sense of self is not confined to material atoms, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But like, what is going on? And like, why can taking a chemical connect your brain to the spiritual world in a certain way? And like, what's that have to do with demons? And like, what? Yeah. How do you make sense of that?
I have plenty of questions. I have plenty of questions myself still. And I think, and on the surface, you look at, it kind of obliterates atheism. Like, oh, well, that's a positive, right? Well, is it? I mean, yeah, yes and no. Like, obliterating atheism is a good thing, but I think there are qualifications to that when we're talking about what you're obliterating atheism into. And I think, and it's interesting to me too, that over time, particularly kind of in my first season of LSD use before I met my husband, once I met my husband, I kind of had another high period because I was in love and it was wonderful. And the world seemed to kind of make sense again, and I was having good trips again. But prior to that, my first, like I said, my first season of LSD, routine LSD use, I felt like the how can I put the pantheism that I initially had embraced and felt like, oh, this makes so much sense. This explains what I've experienced, and this explains reality, I guess. It gradually morphed into, like, really easily morphed into, it was kind of a natural trajectory, morphed into what felt like and looked like nihilism. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really interesting to reflect. And then did the same thing in my, part 2 of my life of LSD use after I met my husband, and we were on that high, and then slowly the trajectory was kind of more stretched out, but also slowly deteriorating into nihilism. Like when I read that children's book, I thought, this is horrible. This is basically saying nothing really matters because it's all just interchangeable, and who cares, and it's not beautiful or comforting or wonderful. It's stupid, and it feels meaningless. And so I think that is something that I've pondered, and it's really interesting to ponder. Like, it's not that the pantheism and nihilism seem kind of like two sides of the same coin. So I look at that and think about what's happening, and the spiritual forces that are at work, and I would say the demonic forces that are at work. And there's this really interesting book too by this guy. I think this is an alias, I'm not sure, but the alias he uses is Louis Ungat. He's on Twitter, and he wrote this book called Return of the Dragon. And it's very much a layperson's book. Like, it doesn't go super in depth, but his theory is that all these, and of course in the psychedelic world, there's lots of talking up of indigenous use of psychedelics, and these substances have been used for millennia by these indigenous cultures, these wise indigenous cultures, and
to help give a sense of moral approval, I think. To
exactly,
what you're doing.
exactly, like legitimacy, and and a sense that there's some like ancient wisdom that's been suppressed,
right. And your parents, who you might have thought were protecting you from telling you to not take drugs, well, they're actually part of this system that's trying to repress the truth, and it's actually been innocent and good this whole time to do this stuff, and
exactly, like something is being withheld from you. It's like the Garden of Eden.
Something good is a similar message for Eve.
Right. Yeah. Something good is being withheld because people are just prudes. But his theory in this book is that when you actually look at these indigenous cultures that for which we have some degree of archaeological evidence that they were involved in psychedelic use, and he talks about like the Mayans and the Incas, they were also really involved in tribal warfare and human sacrifice. Like, I know just recently I've read things about like the scale of the human sacrifice in the Mayan and Incan empires was even greater than we ever had supposed before. And so, and he talks too about a lot of these cultures also had serpent gods, which, is interesting considering the Garden of Eden. And so it kind of ties together, like you see in all these cultures, these common threads, like serpent gods, psychedelic drugs or mind-altering drugs, and human sacrifice. And I just think, like I said, it's very much like a layperson's book. It's not super in depth, but I just think that's really fascinating to contemplate. So it's something that seems so good at the outset. It seems so wonderful. It seems enchanting. It seems liberating. But then, and I've known so many people. One real blessing of writing about this publicly and speaking about it, despite the weird experience of having my neighbors read my book, has been people get in touch with me over social media and say that they had a similar experience. It was a similar trajectory. And I've actually had a couple of people get in touch with me and say that they don't feel like they're fully mentally recovered, which just breaks my heart. Like I said, the acid casualty thing is real. But I just have heard so many stories like of similar, this thing that felt liberating at first became a prison. Like so many similar stories, and stories too of people having demonic encounters on it, which never seems to. I mean, some people do have a horrible trip right from the outset. They never touch them again. That does happen, but for most people, it seems it doesn't happen that way. Like it starts out really good. It starts out, seems beautiful and groovy. And then over time it becomes really, really dark. And I find that fascinating too. You know, something, it seems good at first. It seems good to eat, you know, and then it doesn't.
Yeah. Fascinating. So in college, I'll just say I was a pretty straight-edged goody two-shoes. And so I wasn't really involved with these things. But of course, you know, it's college. I have friends who are and stuff like that. And there would be multiple times where I would be the sober one in the room. I'll just put it that way.
Yeah.
And, you know, like when you're around a bunch of people, like, you know, just say high on pot or something like that.
Yeah.
Like someone will tell a joke and everyone will start laughing. And if you're the sober person, you're like, that joke wasn't the least bit funny. Like, you know,
right.
like, what are you guys laughing about? That was like the lamest, dumbest. Like, if you were to go into a comedy club and try, it would land and you guys all think it's hilarious. What's happening? And I like part of my theory is like inside our brains, like we have like say, you know, a meter in our brains of how funny something is. And it's like one of the effects of pot, say, is to just turn up the dial of how funny everything is. And that might be, you know, a fun thing and stuff, but it's sort of like it's tampering with your brain's sort of kind of natural native settings, and making it like you think that things are funny, but it's not actually because things are funny. It's because your brain's been manipulated in such a way to just be more open to hilarity, even if it's not actually being stimulated properly. And part of me wonders if like the psychedelic thing is like doing something similar with like profundity or spiritual experience, where it's like, our brains are capable of having spiritual experiences and, you know, having intimacy with God, or, you know, however you want to put that. And there's all sorts of stuff like that described in the Christian tradition, but it's like sort of turning up that dial. So it feels like you're having the thing, but the actual stimulus is absent. In the same, like they're, and it's like, you know, when you sometimes try and explain a dream, sometimes in a dream you can have a really strong feeling of whether it's fear or, you know, pick your emotion you can have in a dream. And then when you explain it to someone, it's like, well, actually, it doesn't make sense that I felt that way. It's just that I felt that way really strongly. And I feel like part of the psychedelic pattern, to at least from an outside observer, like being the sober person in the room and being like, what are you guys talking about? Is that it seems like you get the sense of profundity without the thing that actually would cause the profundity in a natural setting. And so you keep going back, like you're actually getting the thing, but you're getting the feeling of having received the thing without anything actually having been delivered that would sufficiently cause it.
Exactly. And the danger is that sense of profundity that has kind of been unleashed can attach itself to anything.
Even if it's not actually profound. Right? You're laughing at a joke that isn't funny. You're finding something profound that isn't actually profound, because it's just good, taking your natural centers and making them way more open to profundity than they should be.
Right. Exactly. And there are lots of studies that have come out about when they've done, I forget if it's MRI or CT, I get confused about the difference between, but scans of the brain while someone is on psilocybin. And they say, and I've heard that those are actually, like, those scans look really impressive to your average person because they don't know, but I've heard that those scans, like, they really don't tell you that much. Like, they're very imprecise. They don't give you that much information. Like, it's very, but there's lots of talk about how psilocybin in particular, probably LSD too, but I guess the tests have been done more on psilocybin. It affects like your default mode network, which I don't even know exactly what that is, but somehow it like you said, it like turns the volume down. Like this network that we would normally be using to make connections between things, it somehow blanks that out for a while. And actually they found out it blanks that out for a while after, you know, maybe intermittently, I don't know. But and there was a man, he published a book years ago. I need to get in touch with him again because he had really interesting things to say. His name was Jim Wilder, and he called himself a neurotheologian. And I was able to get in touch with him and have a conversation with him. And I asked about, you know, like, why do things, like, why? And he didn't have experience with psychedelics. He's a Christian, but I said, like, why do you think the people, like, we would have these experiences that feel profound, like you said, on psychedelics? But then, and I remember on certain trips trying to write things down, having this revelation, be like, oh my gosh, this is the key to existence. Like, this is it.
You got it. Yeah.
Yeah. And writing it down. And the next morning looking at it and thinking, what? Like, that doesn't, because like I said, that sense of profundity can attach itself to anything. And what
it would be like writing down the joke that the people are saying at 2 a.m. in their dorm room and reading it at 10 a.m. the next morning. It's like, that wasn't funny.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And it would always be something just the circuitous and incredibly vague, like everything is everything, or, nothing is nothing, just that kind of thing, and just like, this isn't even really saying anything, but it seemed, like I said, it seemed like the key that just unlocked the secret to existence at the time, because of that sense of profundity and like, oh, this is genius. But what Jim Wilder said is because these drugs are serotonergic, I think, that they're kind of spilling serotonin out into your brain, that the serotonin, that flood of serotonin is what makes us all of a sudden, even though, like you said, normally we have this God-given, that's obviously not perfectly calibrated, being fallen as we are, but this God-given sense of meaning making or profundity that is generally, though not perfect, appropriate, more appropriate. But then when we take these drugs, our brains are just being flooded with serotonin. So it's like, he said, it makes everything seem relevant. It makes everything seem pertinent. And I remember that from, we got hung up on, my husband and I, when we were first in love and we were taking acid together, we get hung up on, we lived in the middle of Kansas City, and there would always be, I don't know why, but there would always be like one stray glove in the street, or there would be like one shoe. I'm like, what happened that people just lose the one? And then one time there was a wig, just these, but it was always like, whoa, look at that. It was like, this is we couldn't have even articulated what that means, but it seemed like gravid with meaning. Like, this has so much meaning, like, here we are at the center of the universe, and here's this discarded wig on the street. But it, like you said, it doesn't have, and then in the cold light of day, it's like, what was that about? And there's also a letdown in that, because it seemed like you had discovered something that was going to change your life, that was going to transform your life. And then you realize, like, oh, what did that mean? That didn't.
Right.
Yeah.
Because it's chemically inducing the experience that you've received the thing, but without giving you the actual thing that would normally give you that experience.
Right. Exactly.
It's like shortcutting from, instead of being a stimulus that could cause, like, that is actually profound, it's just saying, well, I'm going to skip that and go right to your profundity center and turn that up. Right. But I didn't actually give you the profundity or the sense of enlightenment or whatever. It's just that I caused you to feel it, and instead of delivering the real goods itself.
Exactly. And some of these studies I've read, the Johns Hopkins studies, they'll say, especially the news stories that are kind of just like, extrapolating sensational sounding information and putting it in a news story for people, which is really irresponsible when it comes to psychedelics. But they'll say, like, that these people in these studies, a lot of them, well, certainly not all of them, will consistently rank the experience as one of the top 5 most profound experiences of their life, on par with the birth of their first child. And that makes me so sad to think about. It's so sad, because, like you said, it's the experience of profundity without the, like, I can't imagine compare. And maybe at the time when I was still pro psychedelic, I probably would have said that too, that it was on par. But now I'm like, it's not even in the same stratosphere, because, like you said, there's an emptiness to it, because it's the feeling of profundity without the actual corresponding reality.
It's like how opioids are the feeling of pleasure without the actual corresponding thing that your pleasure centers program you to seek after. Or cocaine is the feeling of, like, I don't know, excitement and self-confidence without, like,
euphoria,
without it having been earned. or
Right.
something like that. Psychedelics are tickling a different thing. And just a month ago, I was in the delivery room with a baby, and
Yeah.
it's a pretty profound thing, but
Yeah.
it makes sense
Right.
why a new baby coming into your life would trigger all of these senses of meaningfulness and
Right.
connection
Yeah.
and intimacy and profundity, because like it's supposed to be changing who you are to be
Right.
connecting with this new baby that you'll
Yeah.
have to take care of. And
Exactly.
so the fact that a psychedelic experience rates like that, but it's like, oh, because I was looking at a boot that someone left behind in the
Right.
road,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that kind of helps understand what's going on. But like, what's with the demons?
Mm.
Uh, why are the demons there? And like, how is it that opening our minds to a sense of profundity or something like that, chemically induced, is connecting with sort of the spiritual world, or
Yeah.
leaving our minds open to dark spiritual influence? I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I've known some people who, once they kind of disavow psychedelics and they're done with psychedelics and they become Christian, they would I say this, these people are probably in the minority that I've experienced, that I talked to, would prefer to just disavow that, say it was all hallucinations, none of it was real. And I respect that feeling. I tend to think that a lot of it is real, and that somehow we are accessing the spiritual realm in some sense when we take psychedelics, but that we aren't equipped to do so, and it's actually not good for us to do so in this way.
Mhm.
And like I was reading 1 Corinthians 10 this morning. Paul's talking about food sacrifice to idols, and of course he says a lot of different things. But one verse that really struck me was where he said, like, do you think that you're stronger than God?
Mm,
And I
mhm.
look back and think, like, in a way, like, yeah, I thought I was entitled to go as far as I could on these substances. Like, of course I'm entitled to venture into the spiritual realm, though I wouldn't have framed it in biblical terms at that point. But like, of course I'm entitled to all the knowledge that I can possibly acquire of the spiritual world. And
That
so,
say that paradoxical ego inflation caused by ego death. Yeah.
right,
Mhm.
exactly. And so I think the demons are there because they're there. And I think that we underestimate, and people who are pro psychedelics severely underestimate, the influence and power that those entities can have. And I remember there was one um, thing that really shook me up, that I didn't read about this until years later. It was actually just a few years ago, um, when I had just begun thinking about all these things again. Because for years after I quit psychedelics, I did have kind of that aversion of, I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to think about it. I've left that behind now. It's gone. Those are the old
Mhm.
things. I'm all about Jesus Christ now. Like, I just don't even want to think about that.
Yeah.
And but it was actually when maybe 4 or 5 years ago, I read an article in the New Yorker written by a woman, and she was actually talking about how the article was entitled Ecstasy. So her focus was more on MDMA, ecstasy, but she was talking about how she felt like psychedelics delivered her from, or allowed her to fully leave behind her evangelical childhood, and that they liberated her in that way. She was finally able to shake off all the shackles of her evangelical childhood. And that was what really got me thinking, like, like maybe someone should be providing a different perspective
Yeah.
about this. And there are lots of people. I just didn't, at the time, I didn't know anyone who was writing about it prominently. And I'm sure there was probably a lot of more of that back in the 60s and 70s. But yeah, I can't remember where I was going with that now. I got off on too much of a
Sure,
tangent.
but something like, we were talking about what's the connection with the spiritual realm,
Oh, right.
and
Yes.
being transported to a place where you maybe don't deserve to be or haven't been
Yes.
prepared to be, and
Yeah.
that being actually dangerous for you, not
Right.
elevating for you.
Exactly. Exactly. And there you can find tons of stories of people. It seems like things. I definitely saw entities on LSD and psilocybin, but it wasn't usually as pronounced as when people describe taking DMT or ayahuasca. It seems like they're more pronounced entities, and a lot of times people tell stories about entities saying like you shouldn't be here, and then other times the entities are very enticing and they'll say, hey, come back and bring your friends, and I remember the one time that I smoked salvia. It's called Salvia divinorum, with my husband. It was shortly after we were married, and that was a really weird experience, and I didn't really know much about it at the time, but it is also a very strong psychedelic as far as taking you to a completely different place where like you're not in the room anymore. It's short-lived. It's only about 10 or 15 minutes, but you're not in your physical surroundings anymore. You're in a completely different place. And I remember toward the end of that, it wasn't at the time, it wasn't a bad experience. It wasn't a bad trip. It was weird, but it wasn't bad. But toward the end of that experience, I was on this water wheel with this, what looked like an animated either postage stamp or piece of ravioli. And it had Mickey Mouse hands, and it was really cartoonish, and it spoke in a cartoonish, high-pitched voice like Mickey Mouse. And it kept saying to me, come on, hurry up, we got to go. And the water wheel was spinning around, and it was starting to fade out slowly. I was starting to come back into the room. And so it was kind of this like enchanting figure. This reminded me of a childhood cartoon,
Mhm.
and it kept saying, come on, hurry up, we got to go. And I was trying to follow it, but I couldn't get there. And then several years ago, I remember reading an experience of someone on salvia, and they were talking about the details of what they saw, um, were different. Like the details of the environment they were in were different, but they were talking about at one point toward the end, there was this, like Dickensian street urchin in these raggedy clothes, and was kind of dirty, and was beckoning them and saying, come on, hurry up, we got to go. And that gave me chills, because I thought that is too similar, like the exact same words,
Mhm.
And I find it interesting that when you read these stories, a lot of these entities are beckoning people, and beckoning them to come where? Well, nobody knows. And I find that really fascinating. And I do think that they're they're taking us places that we aren't meant to go and we aren't equipped to go. And like I said, the psychological burden is far greater than even people who think that they're prepared to bear it. Like, they aren't prepared to bear it.
Mhm.
It's because we're not designed to bear it. Um, yeah, so I think it's definitely, like I said, I would not be of the position that it's all just a hallucination. I would be of the position that there is something real about it, and it corresponds in some real way to the spiritual realm.
Mhm. In your more positive experiences of, say, closeness to the divine or whatever, do you think, like, how do you think about the reality of that? Was
Mhm.
it just sort
Yeah.
of like your own divinity senses, your sensus divinitatis was just being tickled? Or do you felt like there wasn't any sense that you were closer to God? Or was it a deceptive closeness to God? Or like, how do you think about that?
You know, I still wonder about that, and I don't know that I have a good answer for it. On one hand, I hesitate to say, oh, yes, that was a real experience of God, because I never want to be, I don't think people should take psychedelics,
Right,
and I
right,
never
right.
want to
You
be the
wouldn't
person.
ever want to recommend, yeah.
Right. But at the same time, I think God can work in whatever way he chooses.
Hmm.
But also at the same time, those experiences never led me to, they always led me to more of the like pantheistic conclusions about who God was, and
Yeah.
what God was like. So I wouldn't say even those experiences that felt, I would say felt even beautiful and felt divine and felt eternal. They weren't. leading me to the truth.
Yeah.
So now I do have a good friend who is now definitely anti-psychedelic, but he would probably, well, I don't know if he would say this. I don't want to put words in his mouth. But initially, when we started talking by email a few years ago, he would have said that his experiences, and he was involved in an ayahuasca community here in the United States, and that those experiences did contribute in some way to him returning to the Christian faith that he had left. He grew up Presbyterian and then left it. But I don't think that he would frame it that way now. But you will find, and I think it's quite rare, but you will find those people out there who would say, oh, this actually led me deeper into my Christian faith. But what's interesting about that too, I had one of those people get in touch with me via social media a few years ago, and he said that it actually led me deeper into my Christian faith. But then when we actually started talking, like, he wasn't even comfortable using the term God anymore. And so I thought, like, I'm not sure that this has led you into an Orthodox Christian faith. And then there was another instance recently where I can't remember if I stumbled across something someone wrote who was kind of making the same claim. But then when I actually started reading the things that they had written, and they actually had a self-published book about, I was like, yeah, this didn't lead you into anything resembling orthodoxy. Like, maybe you would invoke the name of Christ, but it definitely did not lead you into anything even close to resembling Christian orthodoxy.
And so like, it is not recommended as any sort of reliable path to God.
Right.
God can work in strange ways. I mean, like, God worked in your life through the death of your friend's child, but that's not saying that you would ever recommend that your friend's children die so that you can get closer to God.
Exactly.
Right? Like, there's a difference between those two things, of things that might have in some way helped you along your journey, but aren't necessarily recommended as reliable paths to get there.
Right.
And so I guess maybe my last question is, I feel like the world's changing a little bit, and that atheism is sort of losing its gusto, but that it's not necessarily because Christianity is roaring back, but that there is this sense of more spiritual activity in the world. I think maybe a combination of, say, psychedelics, but you could also point to like things like that internal family system stuff. And just sort of other things where the spiritual realm that's maybe been ignored for a long time is seeming more present. But not necessarily because of a Christian re-enchantment or a Christian revival.
Right.
How should Christianity, I don't know, interact with this new world, and how do we reach people in psychedelic land?
That's a wonderful question. Yeah, and I see, like, and I know Justin Brierley wrote a book about the surprising rebirth of belief. And so I think some people are really hopeful about it. But like you said, at the same time, a lot of it does seem to be this either revolving around psychedelics or paganism. Like, I find it startling
or witchcraft or
right. I find it startling when a few months ago we were at Whole Foods, and they had an end cap of crystals, and those little labels with these crystals of like what this crystal is going to do for you, and I was like, oh, okay.
Whole Foods.
At Whole Foods. Wow. Yeah. And I want to say there was even, I think there was a tarot deck too on this end cap. And I find that fascinating, because Whole Foods is a pretty like mainstream health food store. There's not.
But it has flavors of that purity mindset.
It does. There's not as much of the woo-woo as, maybe like an independent health food store but just to see all that stuff really coming into the mainstream. I saw a few weeks ago that Johnny Depp had made his own tarot deck, so these things kind of resurging into they never fully went away, but kind of resurging into the mainstream. And, something about when I wrote my book, I actually, I need to stop reading reviews because it's probably not very healthy for me. Although the encouraging reviews are really wonderful, but I need to usually, like, I think I'll just have my husband start screening things and
pick out the highlights.
Right. Yeah. one gentleman wrote, although he's not always good at that, because after I did the Unbelievable podcast, I was like, I don't want to look at YouTube comments because they can get so nasty, but I was like, you just look at them and you just give me the highlights. And so he was looking through and he just busts out laughing. And I said, okay, now you have to tell me what it said. And he said, he was just laughing so hard. He said, it says this woman is insufferable. And I was like, wow, okay. And he's like, I think you're perfectly sufferable. Thank you. But there was one gentleman who reviewed my book, and I appreciated that he did. And he gave it 4 stars. So it's not like it was a bad review, but he said that I was concerned when I was reading this book that she was making the druggy life too, glorifying the druggy life by making it sound too interesting. And I understand that. I'm not totally unsympathetic to that concern. When I went through and read it, I was like, oh, if you just took you just did a cut and like you took an isolated chunk out of here, you might come away with the idea, oh, this actually sounds fun, but it would have to be an isolated chunk. I mean, reading the book as a whole, I don't see how you could feel that I was glorifying or suggesting in any way psychedelic use.
I completely agree, for the record.
Okay, good to hear. But I guess I felt like it was important for if someone who is not Christian, who is into psychedelics, does pick up the book, which I certainly hope they will, that they fully understand that I've been there and I've experienced the highs. I've very much experienced the highs. And so I think it was important to me to, and I think in talking to people and reaching people who are into psychedelics, like making them understand that the appeal is understood. Like I understand, I was fully bought into it. Like I understand the appeal, and like, it's not, we don't sin because it instantly feels bad. Obviously we sin because it initially feels good. And I guess it was important for me to portray that honestly, because I wanted to show like, yes, it made me feel alive in the beginning. It made me feel alive, in fact, in a way that to that point I hadn't felt alive before. And it felt initially like the key. It felt initially like the thing that would make everything okay forever. And then of course that trajectory changed dramatically over time. But so I think there's something in, like I said, I understand people who prefer to think it's all hallucination. But I think there's something about, it's important to not completely delegitimize the experiences someone has, even though I have my own opinions about them, like we were talking about earlier,
saying that they're bad and that it can cause, and that it can leave you open to demonic influence is not delegitimizing them. And in fact, it's almost saying that it's more profound and dangerous and real than you even realize.
That's a good point. Yeah, that's a really good point. I guess when I say not delegitimizing them is, I guess, like not coming on like a chick tract, or like, I guess that's more what I mean. But absolutely, to show like this is incredibly dangerous in a way that is really deceptive, because you don't perceive it at first. It seems like this wonderful thing. So yeah, you're absolutely right. I guess I think like just dismissing everything out of hand, or I guess what I'm trying to say is, I think if someone had come at me who didn't seem to understand at all, or had never had those experiences, and there is that strain, and I think a lot of Christians just don't have there's just not a lot of contact with the drug world at all. So I've had people ask me like, so it's like cocaine, or like, I'm like, no, it's totally different. So I guess what I'm trying to say, like in sharing my story, I just wanted to illustrate like I've been there. I fully understand the appeal. I fully understand how seductive it is. And I think, gosh, in reaching people, I'm trying to think of like what, and other people have asked me this, like what my suggestion is. And I don't know. I guess I felt like the most powerful way that I could do it was to share my story, to write about my story. Yeah. That for me was like the most powerful way that I feel like I could do that.
Hmm. Well, it's sort of like a mini example of harrowing hell,
Yeah.
right? You know,
Yeah.
Christ becomes all things to all people, but
Yeah.
he does it through us. And it's not like Christ himself was like going on psychedelic trips, but
Right.
like through rescuing Ashley out of it,
Yeah.
right? He brings the path out of it the same way he makes the path out of Hades. You know, it's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah, that's
that
good.
same sort of pattern
Yeah.
that you going down in there. It's not saying it was good, not saying
Right.
anyone should follow it,
Right.
but God can work in and redeem that through your story. So I think that you're right, but I do think it's something that Christians need to be more aware of,
Yes,
and that I
absolutely.
do
Yeah.
think that there is a strange evangelical opportunity there
Yes.
because people in that world are more open to spiritual realities and existence than
That's true.
other sorts of things. So you can
Yeah.
lean into that in
Yeah.
a way that you can't necessarily lean into with an atheist or an agnostic or something like that.
Right. That's true. I hadn't, yeah. Yeah. That there is a door there that would be firmly shut
Right.
with a materialist or an atheist. Yeah,
And
for
also,
sure.
if people are being tormented by demons and they
Yeah.
kind of know it, that offering a solution to that has been very shown to reliably work
Right?
is
Yeah.
something. But
And
it is weird. You talked about that sort of like anti-Christian stubbornness
yeah.
that seemed to sort of like the anything but Christianity worldview of
Yeah.
New Ageism. Yeah.
Yeah. Which is
So,
very, very common. Very common. I know a woman who worked at a really prominent organization that promotes psychedelics and funds psychedelic studies. And she said, she's a Christian now, she's Eastern Orthodox. And she said, like, you would not believe how anti-Christian the people who worked there are. Like the entire organization, like just
mhm.
there's a strain of anti-Christian thought and attitude and posture that runs through the entire thing. Like it's crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, any last thoughts, Ashley?
Um, I don't think so. I really enjoy this. You have some really good insight. Like you put words to things that I thought, oh yes, that's what I was trying to say. That's what I mean. So yeah, it was really wonderful. It was really wonderful for me, and I hope it's wonderful for your listeners.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Ashley. I appreciate the bravery and the, I don't know, sensitivity and vulnerability that it takes to share a story, even one that might seem a little bit embarrassing and that you
Yeah,
cringe when your neighbors find out
right,
about it.
right.
But I do think that there is something redemptive about that, and
Yeah.
that it's a way of reaching people that can't be reached by other means. So thank you, Ashley. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.